Black homeless boy asks to eat with a billionaire. What he does next silences the entire restaurant. In the heart of Manhattan's most exclusive dining district, two worlds collided when 12-year-old Marcus Thompson walked into Lou Bernardine with nothing but dignity and a simple request. The homeless boy's question to billionaire Alexander Sterling, "Can I eat with you tonight?" would shatter the invisible barriers between wealth and poverty, exposing the profound loneliness that success had created. As the restaurant fell silent and cameras began rolling, what started as a desperate plea for food became a viral moment that would challenge everything America believed about worth, opportunity, and the true meaning of human connection. The crystal chandeliers of Lou Bernardine cast dancing shadows across mahogany tables as billionaire tech mogul Alexander Sterling cut into his $200 Wagyu beef. His Armani suit was pressed to perfection, his Rolex caught the light with each precise movement, and his presence commanded the reverent silence that only extreme wealth could purchase. The restaurant's other patrons whispered in hushed tones, stealing glances at the man whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small nations. But Sterling's mind was elsewhere, consumed by the hostile takeover attempt that threatened to destroy everything he'd built over 3 decades. His phone buzzed constantly with updates from his legal team, each message bringing news that his empire was crumbling faster than he could shore it up. Through the restaurant's floor-to-ceiling windows, 12-year-old Marcus Thompson pressed his face against the glass, his breath fogging the pristine surface. His clothes were layers of donated fabric, patched and repatched until they resembled a quilt of urban survival. The cardboard sign beside him read, "Hungry. Anything helps," in careful block letters. But his eyes held something the wealthy diners inside couldn't recognize, intelligence burning like a flame behind the desperation. He'd been living on the streets for 6 months since his grandmother died, navigating the city's shelters and soup kitchens with the survival instincts of someone twice his age. The smell of fresh bread and roasted meat made his stomach clench with hunger, but it was the warmth radiating from inside that truly called to him. Before we dive into this incredible story, I need to share something with you. Did you know that 99% of the people watching our videos aren't actually subscribed to our channel? That's right, 99%. If you're one of them, hitting that subscribe button right now would mean the world to us. It helps us reach more people with these powerful stories that need to be told. And here's a question I want you to think about as we get started. If you were a billionaire eating alone every night, would you have invited a homeless child to join you at your table? Keep that question in mind as we begin this extraordinary story of Marcus Thompson and Alexander Sterling. Marcus had watched the restaurant's rhythm for weeks, learning the patterns of the servers, the preferences of the regular customers, the exact moment when the kitchen staff took their smoke breaks. He knew that Alexander Sterling always sat at table 12, always ordered the same meal, always ate alone despite having enough money to feed half the city. The irony wasn't lost on him that the richest man in the restaurant was also the loneliest. Tonight felt different though. Sterling's usual composed demeanor had cracked, revealing something raw and vulnerable beneath his billionaire armor. The boy recognized desperation in all its forms, whether it wore designer clothes or lived in cardboard boxes. The maitre d' had already called security twice to move Marcus away from the window, but something about the boy's quiet dignity made him hesitate. Marcus didn't beg or make a scene. He simply existed, a living reminder of the world beyond the restaurant's gilded walls. As Sterling's phone rang for the 20th time that evening, Marcus made a decision that would change both their lives forever. He walked to the restaurant's entrance, straightened his shoulders, and prepared to cross the invisible line that separated his world from Sterling's. The doorman's hand moved instinctively to block his path, but Marcus had learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon was simply refusing to be invisible. The restaurant's silence was absolute as Marcus stepped through the doors, his presence creating ripples of discomfort that spread from table to table. Conversations stopped mid-sentence, wine glasses paused halfway to lips, and the soft jazz music seemed to crescendo into an awkward soundtrack for the unfolding drama. The other diners' faces cycled through expressions of shock, disgust, and uncomfortable pity as they processed the sight of genuine poverty in their sanctuary of privilege. Marcus felt their stares like physical weight, but he'd learned long ago that dignity was the one thing no one could take from him. He walked with purpose towards Sterling's table, his worn sneakers silent on the marble floor, carrying himself with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing left to lose. Sterling looked up from his phone to find the homeless boy standing beside his table, close enough that he could smell the street on his clothes, a mixture of rain, concrete, and the particular desperation that came from sleeping in doorways. The billionaire's first instinct was to signal for security, but something in Marcus's eyes stopped him. They weren't the glazed, defeated eyes he'd expected to see, but bright with intelligence and burning with a hunger that went far deeper than food. The boy's presence was unsettling not because he was poor, but because he was so clearly present, so undeniably human in a space designed to insulate the wealthy from such uncomfortable realities. Sterling found himself frozen between his trained responses and a growing sense that this moment was somehow significant. "Excuse me, sir," Marcus said, his voice carrying surprising strength despite his obvious hunger. "I've been watching you eat alone every night for weeks. I know what it's like to be lonely." The words hung in the air like a challenge, stripping away the pretense that wealth could purchase genuine human connection. Sterling's mouth opened, but no sound came out, his billion-dollar vocabulary suddenly inadequate for this unprecedented situation. The boy continued, his gaze never wavering from Sterling's face. "I was wondering if maybe I could eat with you tonight. I don't have money to pay, but I promise I'd be good company. Sometimes two people eating alone are just two people being alone together." The restaurant's atmosphere had shifted from uncomfortable to electric, every patron straining to hear how the billionaire would respond to such an audacious request. Sterling felt the weight of dozens of eyes upon him, knowing that his next words would define not just this moment, but potentially his entire legacy. The takeover attempt, the legal battles, the billions at stake. None of it seemed to matter as much as the simple human request from a 12-year-old boy who had somehow seen through his wealth to the loneliness beneath. Marcus stood waiting, his dignity intact despite his circumstances, offering the one thing Sterling's money couldn't buy: authentic human connection without agenda or expectation. Sterling's hand trembled as he set down his phone, the device that had commanded his attention for decades suddenly seeming less important than the boy standing before him. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice cracking with an emotion he hadn't allowed himself to feel in years. The question seemed to unlock something in the restaurant's frozen atmosphere, creating a small pocket of humanity in the midst of the social experiment unfolding before the other diners. Marcus straightened his shoulders, sensing that this was a moment that would define more than just his next meal. "Marcus Thompson, sir. I'm 12 years old, and I've been on my own for 6 months now." The simple introduction carried the weight of a life story that most people in the restaurant couldn't even imagine. Sterling found himself studying the boy's face, seeing echoes of his own childhood in the intelligent eyes and determined jaw. Before his tech empire, before the billions, before the isolation that wealth had created around him, Alexander Sterling had been Alex Thompson, a black boy from Detroit whose single mother had cleaned offices to pay for his education. The name Thompson hit him like a physical blow, dredging up memories he'd buried beneath layers of success and privilege. "Thompson," he repeated slowly, the word carrying implications that made his chest tighten. That's interesting. Please sit down." The invitation shocked not just Marcus, but every person within earshot, violating every unspoken rule about how wealth and poverty were supposed to interact. As Marcus slid into the leather chair across from Sterling, the billionaire found himself looking at a mirror of his own past, the same hunger for something more than survival, the same refusal to be broken by circumstances beyond his control. The boy's presence forced Sterling to confront the truth he'd been avoiding, that his wealth had become a fortress that kept out not just poverty, but genuine human connection. The takeover attempt that had consumed his thoughts suddenly seemed like cosmic justice. He'd spent so long protecting his empire that he'd forgotten what he was protecting it for. Marcus's simple request to share a meal had exposed the fundamental loneliness that no amount of money could fill. The maitre d' approached their table with visible nervousness, unsure how to handle this unprecedented breach of protocol. Sterling waved him away with an authority that brooked no argument, then turned back to Marcus with something approaching wonder. "Order whatever you want," he said, pushing the menu across the table. "And Marcus? Thank you for asking. I can't remember the last time someone invited me to share a meal just because they thought I might be lonely." The words hung between them like a bridge spanning the gap between their worlds, creating a connection that transcended the vast difference in their circumstances. In that moment, the billionaire and the homeless boy were simply two people recognizing their shared humanity. As Marcus studied the menu with the careful attention of someone who understood the value of every calorie, Sterling found himself asking questions he'd never thought to ask before. Where did Marcus sleep? How did he stay safe on the streets? What had happened to his family? The answers painted a picture of resilience that made Sterling's business struggles seem trivial by comparison. Marcus spoke about his grandmother who had raised him, teaching him to read using newspapers and library books, filling his mind with knowledge even as poverty limited his opportunities. Her death had left him alone in a system that seemed designed to crush children like him, but he'd survived by being smarter, faster, and more determined than anyone expected a 12-year-old to be. "My grandmother used to tell me stories about a man who became very successful but never forgot where he came from," Marcus said, cutting into the prime rib that Sterling had ordered for him. "She said his name was Alexander Sterling, and that he grew up not far from where we lived. She always wondered what happened to him, whether success had changed him or if he remembered the neighborhood kids who used to dream about making it out." The words hit Sterling like a physical blow, memories flooding back of Mrs. Ella Thompson, the woman who had lived 3 doors down from his childhood home. She'd been like a grandmother to half the kids in the neighborhood, always ready with a meal or a story or gentle guidance when parents were working multiple jobs just to survive. Sterling's fork clattered to his plate as the impossible truth crashed over him. "Ella Thompson was your grandmother?" he whispered, his voice barely audible above the restaurant's ambient noise. Marcus nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "She talked about you all the time. Said you were proof that we could make it out if we just worked hard enough and stayed true to who we were. She saved every newspaper article about your company, kept them in a scrapbook she called her Book of Hope. She died believing that you'd remember us someday, that success hadn't made you forget where you came from." The words cut through Sterling's defenses like a blade, exposing the man he'd once been beneath the billionaire he'd become. The restaurant around them faded into background noise as Sterling processed the cosmic coincidence that had brought them together. Mrs. Thompson had been his unofficial grandmother too, the woman who had fed him when his mother worked double shifts, who had helped him with homework when his own kitchen table was covered with bills instead of books. She'd been there for his high school graduation, his college acceptance, the early days of his company when he'd been too broke to afford proper office space. Somewhere along the way, as the billions accumulated and the distance from his roots grew, he'd stopped visiting, stopped calling, stopped remembering the people who had shaped him. Now her grandson sat across from him, a living reminder of his abandoned humanity, offering him the same unconditional acceptance she'd once given. The transformation happened gradually, then all at once. Other diners began noticing the intensity of the conversation at table 12, the way the billionaire's usual armor of superiority had melted away as he listened to the homeless boy's stories. Someone discreetly activated their phone camera, capturing the moment when Sterling reached across the table to take Marcus's hand, tears streaming down his face as he spoke about the grandmother they'd both loved. The image, a black billionaire and a homeless black boy connected by grief and memory, would be shared 1,000,000 times before the night was over. The caption would read, "When success meets its own past," and it would spark conversations about opportunity, responsibility, and the invisible threads that connect us all. Within hours, the video had exploded across social media platforms, but it wasn't the usual viral moment of exploitation or entertainment. This was something deeper, more complex, a real-time documentation of genuine human connection transcending the artificial barriers of wealth and poverty. The comments section became a battleground of perspectives, with some praising Sterling's humanity while others questioned why it had taken a chance encounter to awaken his conscience. Marcus's dignity throughout the encounter, his quiet strength in the face of a situation that would have overwhelmed most adults, became a symbol of resilience that resonated far beyond the restaurant's walls. We continue. I want to remind you that 99% of our viewers still haven't subscribed to our channel. If this story is touching your heart, if Marcus's courage is inspiring you the way it's inspiring me, please take 1 second to hit that subscribe button. It literally takes 1 second, but it helps us share these life-changing stories with millions more people who need to hear them. And don't forget to comment below. Knowing what you know about Mrs. Thompson's influence on both Marcus and Sterling, do you think their meeting was pure coincidence or something deeper? I genuinely want to know what you think, so drop your thoughts in the comments right now. Tentar novamentio Claude pod cometer eros. Confira semper as respostas. The story took on a life of its own as news outlets picked up the viral video, but the narrative quickly shifted from feel-good inspiration to uncomfortable interrogation. Journalists began investigating Sterling's charitable giving, discovering that despite his vast wealth, his donations had been minimal and primarily tax-motivated. The contrast between his billion-dollar lifestyle and his neighborhood's continued poverty became a talking point on every major news program. Marcus's simple request to share a meal had inadvertently exposed the wider issue of wealth inequality and the moral obligations that came with extreme success. The boy who had just wanted company for dinner had accidentally started a national conversation about social responsibility. As the video continued to spread, reaching millions of viewers worldwide, Sterling found himself at the center of a cultural moment he'd never anticipated. The phone that had buzzed constantly with takeover updates now rang with interview requests, speaking engagements, and demands for comment on his newfound activism. But the most important call came from his lawyers, informing him that the hostile takeover had been mysteriously withdrawn. Apparently, his humanized public image had made him too valuable to destroy. Success had protected him once again, but this time it felt different. This time, he understood that his wealth came with obligations that extended far beyond profit margins and shareholder value. 1 year later, the Sterling Foundation had become one of the most innovative philanthropic organizations in the country, with Marcus Thompson serving as its youngest board member and most influential advisor. The foundation's mission, to identify and support children aging out of the foster care system, had been Marcus's idea, born from his own experience navigating the gap between childhood and survival. Sterling's approach to charity had evolved from writing checks to creating systems, from managing poverty to eliminating its root causes. The billionaire who had once eaten alone now hosted regular dinners for homeless youth, understanding that sometimes the most powerful gift was simply being seen as worthy of sharing a meal. Marcus had moved from the streets to a scholarship program at a prestigious private school, but he insisted on spending his weekends at the foundation, mentoring other children who had aged out of the system. His transformation was remarkable not because he'd escaped poverty, but because he'd maintained his essential humanity throughout the journey. He spoke at corporate events and charity galas with the same quiet dignity he'd shown that night in the restaurant, challenging audiences to see beyond their assumptions about worth and potential. His story had become a case study in resilience, but he was careful to always acknowledge that not every child in his situation would have the same opportunities. The restaurant where it all began had been transformed into a community center, with Sterling purchasing the building and converting it into a space where homeless youth could access services, education, and most importantly, human connection. The mahogany tables where wealthy diners had once eaten in isolation now hosted tutoring sessions, job training programs, and communal meals that brought together people from all walks of life. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. The space that had once separated the haves from the have-nots now served as a bridge between worlds that had seemed impossibly far apart. Sterling's business empire had not only survived the crisis, but had thrived, with investors drawn to a leader who had demonstrated authentic humanity in an industry known for its cold calculations. The takeover attempt had been defeated not by legal maneuvering or financial resources, but by the simple power of genuine human connection. Marcus's request to share a meal had saved more than just a lonely billionaire's evening. It had saved his soul, his company, and countless other lives through the ripple effects of their encounter. The boy who had pressed his face against the glass had shattered the invisible barriers that separated wealth from humanity, creating a new model for what success could look like when measured in human terms rather than dollar signs. If this story changed your perspective like it changed mine, you're part of the 99% who watch but haven't subscribed yet. One click helps us reach millions more with stories that matter. Subscribe now and tell me in the comments. Would you have had Marcus's courage to walk into that restaurant? Your answer might surprise you. Tentar novamente o Claude pod cometer eros. Confira semper as respostas. Marcus's courage transformed a billionaire's heart and sparked a movement that continues to reshape how we think about success and responsibility. Their shared meal became a bridge between worlds, proving that sometimes the most powerful force isn't money or influence, but simply the willingness to see another person's humanity. In a society that measures worth by wealth, how many Marcus Thompsons are we still walking past without seeing?